In the granite quarries of Shelburne Falls, Vermont, the O'Hara children played games that would have sent other mothers running. They pressed their palms to hot stove iron just to watch the skin whiten, laughed at the hiss. 7-year-old Aidan O'Hara reached across the breakfast table that October morning in 1864, his small fingers wrapping around the iron kettle handle like it was nothing more than cool pewter. The metal had been sitting on the cook stove all night, hot enough to raise blisters on grown men's hands. The boy lifted it as casually as picking up a wooden spoon. Maeve O'Hara watched her son pour steaming water into the wash basin, his grip steady and sure. No wince, no sharp intake of breath, no hasty pulling away. Nothing. "Aidan, love," she said, her voice carefully measured like Sunday prayers. "Set that down gentle now." The boy smiled at her, that bright gap-toothed grin that usually warmed her heart like summer sunshine. Today, it made her stomach flutter with something colder than winter wind. His palm, when she turned it over in her own work-roughened hands, showed angry red welts across the flesh. The burns would blister before noon. "Does this hurt you at all?" she asked, pressing her thumb gently against the scalded skin. "Hurt?" Aidan tilted his head like a curious sparrow. "What's hurt, Ma?" Outside, the steam whistle pierced the morning mist, calling the quarrymen to their daily dance with granite and danger. Maeve reached for the tin of lard, her movements automatic from months of practice. She'd learned to watch her children's hands and feet the way other mothers watched the sky for storms. Burns, cuts, scrapes appeared on their small bodies like frost on windows, silent and sudden. "Let me wrap this for you, then." Her voice carried the textile rhythm of a woman who'd spent her girlhood at the spinning wheel. "We'll weave some soft cloth around it, keep it clean as new yarn." The other children thundered down the narrow stairs, their bare feet slapping against pine boards with the enthusiasm of creatures who'd never learned to fear falling. Seamus, 9 years old and built like his father, bounded into the kitchen with torn knuckles that wept red down his wrist. Behind him came the twins, Cillian and Bridget, 8 years old and marked with yesterday's adventures. Little Nell, just 5, carried a gash along her forearm that would have sent most children screaming to their mothers. None of them seemed to notice. Patrick O'Hara filled the doorway like granite fills a quarry, his broad shoulders dusted with stone powder that caught the slanted morning light. His own hands bore the accumulated scars of 20 years working Vermont stone, but his calluses had been earned through pain, learned through careful attention to his body's warnings. His children collected injuries like other children collected pretty stones. "Morning, love," he said, pressing a kiss to Maeve's temple. His voice carried the rhythm of hammers on stone, steady and sure. "The children ready for their lessons with Mrs. Abbott?" Maeve nodded, still wrapping Aidan's burned palm with strips of clean linen. "Though I wonder sometimes what manner of lessons they truly need." The children ate their porridge with bandaged hands, chattered about their plans to explore the quarry's edges after school. Their laughter echoed off the kitchen walls like birdsong, pure and untroubled. They spoke of climbing the tallest granite faces, of touching the steam pipes that other children feared, of games that required no caution because they felt no consequence. Watching them, Maeve felt something like dread settling in her chest, heavy as wet wool. Ruth Abbott's kitchen smelled of beeswax and worry. The neighbor woman had asked to examine the children's hands after seeing them play too close to the quarry's dangerous machinery. Now she sat at her pine table, counting wounds with the methodical care of a seamstress counting stitches. 5 cuts on this hand alone, Ruth murmured, turning Aiden's small palm toward the window light. Deep ones, too, and this burn from this morning. How many do you count, Aiden? Maeve asked softly. The boy studied his own hand with the detached interest of someone examining a curious stone. None, Ma. I don't see any. Ruth Abbott's needle-worn fingers trembled slightly as she dabbed iodine onto wounds that should have made a child shriek. The antiseptic solution bubbled and foamed against the broken skin, its sharp medicinal bite filling the air. Aiden watched the process with fascination, as if observing some interesting scientific experiment performed on someone else entirely. They're so quiet, Ruth whispered, her voice thin as thread. Children should cry when you clean their cuts. It's natural. Maeve nodded, understanding flooding through her like cold water through cracked ice. Other mothers feared their children's pain, rushed to soothe away hurts and tears. She had learned to fear the absence of both. Her children moved through the world like sleepwalkers, accumulating damage they couldn't feel, collecting injuries like silent prayers to an unhearing God. The afternoon light slanted through Ruth's kitchen window, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the golden air. In that strange, beautiful moment, Maeve saw her children clearly, as if viewing them through water. They sat so still, so patient, while Ruth tended wounds that registered nowhere in their young minds. They were like ships sailing calm seas, unaware of the rocks lurking beneath the surface. Beautiful children, damaged children, children who lived in a world without warnings. Ruth Abbott finished her gentle ministrations and stepped back, her face pale as birch bark. She wiped her hands on her apron, then wiped them again, as if trying to clean away more than just the iodine stains. Maeve, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, what manner of children are these? Caleb Dunn had worked granite for 30 years, and he'd never seen laborers like the O'Haras. They swung sledges until their hands split open, then kept swinging. The November dawn broke cold and colorless over Shelburne Falls, painting the quarry walls in shades of pewter and shadow. Steam rose from the work engines like incense, and the morning whistle cut through air so sharp it could fracture glass. Patrick O'Hara and his sons moved through the pre-dawn ritual of dangerous work with the casual grace of men who feared nothing because they felt nothing. Caleb watched from his foreman's perch as Patrick positioned himself beside the steam-powered granite splitter, a machine that had claimed fingers from lesser men. The Irishman's broad shoulders moved with the rhythm of hammers on stone, steady and sure, while his boys worked the smaller tools with hands that bled freely and healed crooked. The sight made something twist in Caleb's chest, part admiration, part unease. Done. Patrick's voice carried across the quarry like iron ringing against rock. This granite's solid as good steel. We'll have her split clean by noon if the steam holds. The foreman nodded, noting how Patrick spoke in the language of tools and stone, his metaphors drawn from the materials he shaped daily. The man was tempered like good metal himself, Caleb thought. But there was something unnatural in how his family bore damage without complaint. Other workers nursed their injuries, learned caution from pain's sharp lessons. The O'Haras simply accumulated scars. Young Seamus O'Hara, barely 12 but built like a quarryman already, worked the chisel with precision that would have impressed veteran stonecutters. His technique was flawless, his endurance remarkable. But when the sharp edge slipped and opened his palm to the bone, slicing through skin and muscle with surgical precision, the boy only paused to examine the wound with curious detachment. "Tickles," he said, grinning at his father. The word hung in the cold air like fog. The other quarrymen stopped their work, hammers frozen mid-swing, steam hissing into sudden silence. They stared at the crimson streaming down Seamus's wrist, at his untroubled smile, at the way he flexed his fingers to watch the wound gape and close like some grotesque mouth. Tommy Morrison, who'd lost 2 fingers to careless moments with chisels, dropped his tools and walked away without a word. His face had gone white as quarry dust. "Best wrap that, son," Patrick said mildly, as if discussing the weather. "Don't want to stain the good granite." By afternoon, the whispers started. They began in the mill where wives gathered to discuss their husbands' reports from the quarry. They spread through the general store, where bolt cloth and speculation were measured in equal portions. They drifted through the schoolyard, where children's cruelty found fresh targets with unerring accuracy. Stonebloods, the neighbor children called them during recess, throwing pebbles that left bruises the O'Hara children never seemed to notice. Devil's spawn who can't feel God's correction. Little Nell O'Hara, barely 5 years old, stood in the center of the schoolyard with her pinafore torn and her face decorated with small cuts from flying stones. She smiled at her tormentors with the serene confusion of a child who understood neither pain nor malice. Her bright laughter rang across the playground like broken bells. "Why are you throwing rocks?" she asked, her voice sweet as honey over biscuits. "Are we playing?" The older children backed away, unsettled by her cheerful bewilderment. There was something profoundly wrong about hurting someone who couldn't feel hurt, something that violated the basic rules of childhood warfare. Even bullies required the satisfaction. Sunday morning found the O'Hara family occupying their usual pew in the white steepled church, their bandaged hands folded in prayer, their faces turned toward Reverend Amos Wright's pulpit with the respectful attention of the genuinely faithful. But the wooden benches around them had grown notably empty, families choosing seats farther back, farther away from the strange quiet that surrounded the Irish clan. Reverend Wright studied his congregation with the careful eye of a shepherd counting sheep, noting the gaps around the O'Haras like missing teeth in a comb. His sermon that morning dwelt heavily on divine correction, on the blessed nature of suffering that brought souls closer to God's understanding. "Pain," he declared, his voice echoing off the plain wooden walls, "is the Lord's great teacher. Through suffering, we learn humility. Through hurt, we discover compassion. But what?" He paused, his gaze settling on the O'Hara pew. "What becomes of flesh that knows not God's correction?" The congregation shifted restlessly, their whispers rustling like autumn leaves. Mothers drew their children closer. Fathers studied their hymn books with sudden intensity. Maeve O'Hara kept her eyes fixed on her folded hands, her face composed but pale. She felt the weight of curious stares, the press of whispered speculation. Her children sat beside her like small angels, unmarked by the malice around them, protected by their strange immunity from both physical pain and emotional understanding. After the service, families streamed past them with careful politeness, their conversations dying when O'Hara's approached, resuming in urgent undertones once they'd passed. Caleb Dunn lingered near the church steps, his weather-beaten face troubled. "Patrick," he said quietly, "might want to speak with you about the boys working the high scaffolds." "They're strong workers," Patrick replied, his voice carrying the defensive edge of a man who'd heard whispers. "Solid as granite, tempered like good steel. That's the problem." Caleb shifted his weight, his own scarred hands working at his hat brim. "They don't know when to stop." Pain's what keeps a man alive in dangerous work, makes him careful. Your boys. He trailed off, searching for words that wouldn't give offense. My boys what? They're fearless, and fearless men don't live long in the quarries. The November wind moaned through the bare maples surrounding the churchyard, carrying the scent of coming snow and the distant sound of the quarry's afternoon shift beginning their work. Patrick O'Hara looked toward the granite faces where his sons would spend their afternoon, and for just a moment, something flickered behind his steady gaze. Understanding, worry, the beginning of fear. Dr. Silas Finch sat in his buggy at the edge of the quarry, his black medical bag resting beside him like a faithful hound. He'd come to check on young Morrison's injured hand, but found himself watching the O'Hara family with the fascination of a naturalist observing some new species. Seamus O'Hara worked the afternoon shift with his palm split open like a ripe fruit, the wound gaping with each grip of his hammer. Blood had soaked through the makeshift bandage and dried to rusty brown, but the boy's rhythm never faltered. He paused only to examine his hand with scientific curiosity, flexing his fingers to study the way muscle and sinew move beneath the damaged skin. Interesting, he called to his younger brother. You can see right down to the bone. Dr. Finch felt something cold settle in his stomach. In 30 years of practicing medicine, he'd learned to read pain like other men read weather. It showed in tensed shoulders, in careful movements, in the 1,000 small accommodations the body made to protect itself from further damage. The O'Hara children showed none of these signs. They moved through their dangerous world like sleepwalkers, accumulating injuries with the casual indifference of collecting autumn leaves. Beautiful children, he thought. Damaged children who had no way of knowing they were being damaged. As he watched Seamus grin and flex his wounded hand, calling the deep laceration tickling, Dr. Finch reached for his journal and began to write. Dr. Silas Finch had delivered babies, set bones, and closed dying eyes, but he'd never encountered patients who smiled through procedures that should have left them screaming. His examination room smelled of carbolic acid and uncertainty on that December morning when Maeve O'Hara brought her children for what she called a consultation about their constitutions. The leather medical bag sat open beside his desk, like a mouth displaying its teeth. Forceps, scalpels, needles, and instruments designed to probe the mysteries of human flesh. But how did one examine patients who felt nothing? Sit still now, Aiden, Maeve said gently, though the boy needed no such instruction. At 7 years old, he perched on the examination table with the patience of a carved saint, his bandaged hands folded in his lap like small prayer books. Dr. Finch began with simple tests, a pinprick to the fingertip. The needle slid through skin with the ease of threading silk, drawing a bright bead of blood. But Aiden's expression remained placid as a mill pond. The child watched the crimson drop with scientific interest, as if observing some curious experiment performed on someone else entirely. Does that hurt, son? What's hurt? Aiden asked, the same question he'd posed to his mother months ago. His voice carried genuine confusion, like a child asking about colors he'd never seen. Dr. Finch made careful notes, his pen scratching across paper with the sound of mice in walls. He tried a heated iron rod, pressing it briefly against the boy's palm. The skin sizzled and whitened, filling the air with the acrid scent of burned flesh, but Aiden only tilted his head with curiosity. That smells interesting, the boy observed. Like when Ma burns the porridge. The doctor's hand trembled slightly as he set down the instrument. In 30 years of practice, he'd learned to read pain like scripture, interpreting its signs and meanings. Pain was medicine's most honest witness, the body's great bell that rang warnings of danger and damage. These children possessed bells that never rang. Young Cillian O'Hara, 8 years old and bearing fresh cuts from morning adventures, submitted to electrical stimulation with the enthusiasm of a child at a county fair. The galvanic apparatus sent currents through his small frame that should have produced involuntary muscle contractions, sharp discomfort, the natural recoil of flesh from harm. Instead, Cillian giggled. "It tickles like grasshoppers," he said, watching the electrical wires with delight. "Can you make it stronger?" Dr. Finch felt something cold settle in his chest, heavy as winter stone. He'd treated soldiers with battlefield injuries, miners crushed by cave-ins, children scalded by steam engines. All had taught him the same fundamental truth. Pain protected. It warned, it preserved, it kept the vulnerable alive through careful fear. What protected those who felt no warnings? "Mrs. O'Hara," he said, setting down his instruments with careful precision. "Might we speak privately?" Maeve's face had grown pale as birch bark during the examination, her textile-worn hands twisting together like yarn on a spindle. She followed him to the corner of the room where winter light slanted through frost-etched windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits. "Doctor, what manner of affliction is this?" Her voice carried the measured cadence of prayer, but underneath ran a current of deep fear. "My children. They're woven through with something I can't name, frayed at the edges in ways I can't mend." Dr. Finch chose his words carefully, like a man selecting stones for a foundation. "Pain, Mrs. O'Hara, is the body's great bell. It rings to warn us of danger, to teach us caution, to preserve our flesh from destruction." He paused, watching understanding dawn in her eyes, like terrible sunrise. "Your children's bells, they never ring." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the children's cheerful chatter, as they examined the doctor's instruments with fearless curiosity. Bridget had discovered his surgical needles and was testing their sharpness against her fingertips, drawing little lines of blood with artistic precision. "They're harbors without lighthouses," Dr. Finch continued, his clinical precision beginning to fragment under the weight of what he was witnessing. "Ships sailing without compass, destined for rocks they cannot see approaching." Maeve's breath caught like fabric on a nail. Can medicine cure such a thing? I don't know. The admission tasted bitter as burnt coffee. I've read of similar cases in medical journals from Europe, but they're rare as honest politicians. Most don't survive to adulthood. The words hung in the carbolic-scented air like funeral bells. A week later, young Cillian O'Hara arrived at the doctor's door with a gash along his forearm that opened muscle to bone, the edges gaping like a second mouth. He'd caught it on broken granite while playing in the quarry, he explained cheerfully, and thought it looked interesting enough to show the doctor man. Dr. Finch found himself performing surgery at his kitchen table by lamplight, the flame casting dancing shadows on the walls, while Cillian hummed a tune his mother had taught him. The boy watched the needle pierce his skin with the fascination of a scholar observing rare phenomena, occasionally commenting on the interesting way blood moved through damaged tissue. "Does the thread hurt going through?" Dr. Finch asked, though he already knew the answer. "Feels like nothing," Cillian said happily. "Like putting thread through cloth, except the cloth is me." The doctor's hands moved with practiced precision, but his mind reeled with implications. How many internal injuries went unnoticed? How many infections spread unchecked through bodies that gave no warnings? How many bones healed crooked because pain never signaled the need for careful positioning? Each stitch pulled flesh together in neat, surgical lines. But Dr. Finch felt as though he was trying to mend something far more fundamental. The unnatural quiet of procedures without groans filled his kitchen like fog, broken only by Cillian's cheerful humming and the soft hiss of the oil lamp. "All finished," he announced, tying off the final suture. The wound would heal, he knew, but the scar would join a constellation of others mapping the boy's journey through a world that couldn't hurt him and therefore couldn't teach him. That night, Dr. Finch sat at his desk with his journal open before him, the pen heavy in his fingers like a gravedigger's spade. Candlelight flickered across the page as he struggled to find words for what he'd witnessed. How did one document the absence of something so fundamental to human experience? Finally, he began to write. December 15th, 1864. I fear these children are ships sailing without compass, destined for rocks they cannot see approaching. They move through our dangerous world with the confidence of the invulnerable, accumulating damage like interest on an unpayable debt. Their bodies heal, but healing without pain's guidance produces only crooked mending, scarred approximations of wholeness. Most troubling is their complete inability to comprehend their own condition. Pain is not merely sensation, but teacher, protector, the fundamental mercy that preserves life through fear. Without it, they are beautiful vessels sailing into certain shipwreck, and I fear no earthly medicine can provide the lighthouse they so desperately need. The candle guttered in a draught that smelled of coming snow, and Dr. Finch set down his pen with the weight of a man who'd glimpsed something beyond his understanding. Outside, the December wind moaned through the bare trees, like a voice calling warnings that no one could hear. In the morning, he knew, the O'Hara children would wake to another day of fearless exploration, their bodies accumulating damage while their minds remained untouched by consequence. And he would watch and document and wonder how long human flesh could endure without the cruel mercy of feeling pain. By winter's end, the O'Hara children carried more scars than veteran soldiers, yet moved through the world with the confidence of the invulnerable. March wind howled through the quarry scaffolding like a banshee's warning, but 12-year-old Eamon O'Hara heard only opportunity. The steam pipes that snaked along the granite face gleamed with condensation, their surfaces hot enough to brand cattle. Yet the boy moved among them with the casual grace of someone strolling through a meadow. His woolen sleeve caught fire first. The fabric ignited against the scalding metal with a soft whoosh that should have sent him screaming toward the water barrels. Instead, Eamon paused to examine the flames with scientific curiosity, batting at them with his bare hand as if shooing away troublesome flies. The acrid smell of burning wool filled the air, mixing with the sharper scent of scorched flesh. "Eamon!" Caleb Dunn's voice cracked across the quarry like a whip. "Boy, you're on fire." The child looked down at his smoldering sleeve with mild surprise. "So I am," he said pleasantly, finally dunking his arm in the nearest water bucket. Steam hissed up from the contact, and when he pulled his hand free, the skin had blistered in perfect geometric patterns where the flames had kissed it. Caleb felt his own hands shaking as he wrapped the boy's burns. In 40 years of quarry work, he'd seen men reduced to tears by lesser injuries. Eamon hummed a little tune, while the foreman applied salve to flesh that should have been screaming for mercy. "Does it hurt at all, lad?" "Feels like nothing," Eamon replied cheerfully. "Ma says I'm lucky that way." Lucky. The word tasted like ashes in Caleb's mouth. The damage accumulated like debt. Cillian's finger had healed wrong after a chisel mishap, the bone setting crooked because pain never signaled the need for careful positioning. Now it jutted at an unnatural angle, a small monument to the body's failed warnings. Bridget walked with a slight limp from a fall that had torn ligaments she couldn't feel tearing. Little Nell's hands bore burn scars arranged like constellations, each mark a story of contact with dangers that registered nowhere in her young mind. They moved through their dangerous world like sleepwalkers, beautiful and damned. The community's patience wore thin as winter ice. "Something's got to be done," declared Martha Hodges at the monthly town meeting, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who'd buried 3 children and knew the weight of loss. "Those O'Hara young ones are a danger to themselves and others. Yesterday I saw little Bridget stick her hand clean through a broken window just to see what was on the other side. Cut herself to ribbons and laughed about it." Worried murmurs rippled through the assembled townspeople, like wind through grain. The meeting hall smelled of lamp oil and collective anxiety, shadows dancing on wooden walls as men and women debated the fate of children who couldn't feel their own destruction. "They're good workers," Caleb offered, though his voice lacked conviction. He'd seen too much, worried too long about liability and safety. Patrick O'Hara's solid as granite, tempered like good steel. His boys know their trade. "Knowing and feeling are different things," countered Samuel Wright, the banker whose practical nature extended to all matters of risk. "A man who can't feel his fingers being crushed doesn't pull them back in time. These children, they're walking accidents waiting to happen." Ruth Abbott rose from her seat near the back, her face pale as candle wax. "I've tended their wounds," she said quietly. "Cuts that would have grown men weeping, burns that should send children running to their mothers. They sit still as carved saints while I clean their injuries, smiling like it's all some grand game." The silence that followed carried weight like stones. Dr. Finch cleared his throat from his corner seat, his medical bag resting at his feet like a faithful hound. "I've documented their condition as thoroughly as possible," he said, his voice carrying the careful precision of a man walking on ice. "They possess what medical literature calls congenital analgesia, an absence of pain sensation from birth. It's remarkably rare." "Rare or not," Martha Hodges declared, "it's unnatural. Children should cry when they're hurt. It's how they learn to be careful, how they stay alive long enough to grow up." The debate continued into the night, voices rising and falling like waves against stone. Some called for the family to be barred from the quarry work. Others suggested sending them away entirely. A few whispered darker possibilities, their words heavy with fear and superstition. Through it all, one truth emerged clear as spring water. The O'Hara children were accumulating damage faster than their young bodies could heal, and no one knew how to save them from themselves. The next morning brought news that settled the matter for many. Eamon O'Hara had volunteered for the highest scaffold work, the dangerous job of setting charges on the quarry's upper face. At 14, he possessed the fearlessness that made him valuable and the inability to feel danger that made him irreplaceable. While other workers climbed with careful attention to rope and harness, checking their safety lines with the devotion of men who understood mortality, Eamon ascended like a child climbing an apple tree. The scaffold timbers groaned under March wind that could knock a careful man to his death. But Eamon O'Hara heard no warnings in those sounds, felt no fear in his belly when the platform swayed. He simply climbed higher, always higher, driven by the terrible gift of numbness that made him brave beyond reason. Caleb Dunn watched from below, his work-scarred hands clenched into fists. The boy moved with fluid grace among the swaying timbers, setting his charges with the precision of a master craftsman. But grace without caution was just another word for catastrophe, and catastrophe, Caleb knew, was patient as stone. The wind picked up, setting the scaffolding to singing like a harp strung with fear. Other workers climbed down, heeding the warnings their bodies gave them. But Eamon O'Hara remained aloft, deaf to danger's call, his young face turned toward the sky like a flower-seeking sun. Below, 50 quarrymen held their breath and waited for gravity to teach what pain could not. The granite ledge was slick with morning frost when Eamon O'Hara lost his footing, and for one crystalline moment, 50 quarrymen held their breath in perfect unison. Time stretched like heated glass. The 14-year-old boy's arms windmilled against empty air, his face wearing not terror, but mild surprise, as if he'd simply miscalculated a step while climbing garden stairs. His work boots scraped against stone with the sound of chalk on slate, seeking purchase that wasn't there. Then gravity claimed him. Eamon fell 40 feet through air that sparkled with granite dust and morning light. His body struck the quarry floor with a sound like breaking crockery, wet and final and wrong. The echo bounced off the stone walls once, twice, then died into silence so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. Granite dust hung in the air like fog after impact, settling slowly on the crumpled form that had been a laughing boy just heartbeats before. 50 men stared down from scaffolds and ledges, their faces frozen in the universal expression of witnesses to catastrophe. The steam engines continued their mechanical breathing, indifferent to human tragedy. Caleb Dunn reached the bottom first, his boots clattering down the wooden ladders with the desperate speed of a man racing death itself. What he found defied every natural law he understood about pain and survival. Eamon O'Hara was trying to stand. The boy's legs bent at angles that made grown men turn away, bones shattered like kindling beneath flesh that had gone white as quarry dust. Blood seeped through his work clothes in spreading patterns that mapped the geography of internal damage. Yet his face wore the same cheerful confusion it might have shown if he'd simply tripped over a root while walking. "What's wrong?" Eamon asked, looking up at the circle of horrified faces surrounding him. His voice carried genuine puzzlement, as if the crowd's terror was the strange part of this scene. Why's everyone staring? Tommy Morrison, who'd seen men die in mining accidents, doubled over and vomited into the granite chips. The sound was wet and terrible in the unnatural quiet. "Don't move, lad," Caleb whispered, though his voice shook like autumn leaves. "Don't try to." But Eamon was already attempting to rise, his hands pushing against the ground while his ruined legs folded beneath him like broken umbrellas. The sight of bone jutting through skin at impossible angles, combined with the boy's pleasant smile, created a tableau so fundamentally wrong that several quarrymen simply walked away, unable to process what they witnessed. "It's the strangest thing," Eamon continued conversationally, studying his own mangled limbs with scientific interest. "My legs don't seem to be working right. They feel odd, not painful exactly, just different." Dr. Finch arrived with his black bag and a prayer on his lips, but stopped short when he saw the scene. In 30 years of practicing medicine, he'd learned to read the signs of impending death. Eamon O'Hara should have been unconscious from shock, screaming from agony, or already crossing into whatever lay beyond breathing. Instead, the boy chatted pleasantly about the interesting angle of his own broken bones. "Fascinating," Eamon said, flexing his fingers experimentally. Look how the white bit sticks out here. Is that what you call bone, Dr. Finch? The physician knelt beside the boy with hands that trembled like prayer flags in wind. Eamon's pulse fluttered weak as butterfly wings. His skin had taken on the gray pallor of serious blood loss, yet his eyes remained bright with curiosity rather than dimmed by pain's merciful fog. "Eamon," Dr. Finch said carefully, "you've been badly hurt. You mustn't try to move." "Hurt?" The boy's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "But I don't feel hurt. Well, I suppose I feel rather strange, but not hurt. Mother always says we're lucky that way." The word lucky fell into the quarry's silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples of horror through the watching men. Several more turned away, their faces white as lime. Even veterans of dangerous work, men who'd seen fingers crushed and backs broken, found themselves unable to watch this cheerful examination of catastrophic injury. Dr. Finch worked with the frantic precision of a man trying to hold back the tide with his bare hands. He splinted what could be splinted, bandaged what could be bandaged, administered laudanum that seemed to have no effect on someone who felt no pain to begin with, all while Eamon chatted pleasantly about the curious numbness in his legs and the interesting red patterns his blood made in the granite dust. "Will I be able to climb the scaffolds tomorrow?" the boy asked with genuine concern. "Pa's counting on me for the high work. I'm not afraid of heights, you know." The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that no one wanted to contemplate. Dr. Finch met Caleb Dunn's eyes across the broken boy's body, and in that look passed a communication deeper than words. They both understood that Eamon O'Hara would never climb again, would likely never walk again, might not survive the week. But Eamon himself remained blissfully unaware of his body's verdict. As the doctor worked, splints being cut from green pine filled the air with resin scent that mixed strangely with the metallic tang of blood. The boy's cheerful commentary provided a surreal soundtrack to emergency medicine. Observations about the pretty colors bruises made, questions about whether bones always bent in such interesting directions, wonder at how his legs had become so uncooperative. The crowd of quarrymen gradually thinned as men found urgent business elsewhere, unable to bear witness to this violation of nature's basic rules. Pain was supposed to protect, to teach, to warn. Watching someone cheerfully examine their own destruction felt like watching the world turn backwards. By afternoon, only Dr. Finch, Caleb Dunn, and Patrick O'Hara remained beside the makeshift stretcher. Patrick's face had gone gray as granite, his work-hardened hands trembling as he looked down at his son. For the first time since his children had been born without pain's protection, the full weight of their condition pressed down on him like quarry stone. "He doesn't understand," Patrick whispered, his voice breaking like old rope. "He thinks he'll be walking tomorrow." Dr. Finch packed his instruments with movements that seemed to age him years with each motion. The laudanum had finally taken some effect, sending Eamon into a drowsy half-sleep, where he mumbled contentedly about getting back to work soon. His ruined legs lay still beneath blankets, but his face wore the peaceful expression of someone napping in afternoon sunshine. "The mercy of not feeling pain," Dr. Finch said quietly, "becomes the cruelest curse when pain is the only thing that might save you." As they prepared to transport Eamon home, the boy's eyes fluttered open one last time. His gaze found his father's face, and he smiled with all the innocent trust of a child who'd never learned to fear his own mortality. "Pa," he whispered, "was I good worker today?" The question shattered something in Patrick O'Hara's chest. something that had held firm through years of watching his children accumulate damage without complaint. Tears cut tracks through granite dust on his weathered cheeks as he nodded, unable to trust his voice. The watching men saw a father's heart break in real time, saw the moment when denial finally surrendered to terrible truth. And in that moment, they understood that the O'Hara family's strange condition wasn't a blessing disguised as affliction. It was affliction disguised as blessing, and they had all been witnesses to its most terrible revelation. In the gathering twilight, as they carried Eamon O'Hara away from the quarry that had claimed his future, his puzzled smile remained fixed in place, beautiful and damned and utterly unaware of the ruin that surrounded him. Time is the cruelest doctor, and it prescribed the O'Haras a slow diminishment, infection taking Bridget, internal bleeding claiming Patrick, accidents accumulating like interest on an unpayable debt. The fever came for 8-year-old Bridget O'Hara on a Tuesday morning in May 1867. It crept through her small body like smoke through a house, invisible and silent, raising her temperature to dangerous heights while she played contentedly with her corn-husk dolls. By the time Maeve noticed the flush in her daughter's cheeks, the child's skin burned hot as stove iron. "Bridget, love," Maeve whispered, pressing her palm to the girl's forehead. "How do you feel?" "Fine, Ma." Bridget's voice carried the sweet clarity of church bells, unmarked by the distress that should have accompanied such blazing heat. "Just a little sleepy, maybe." Sleepy. The word fell like a stone into still water. Dr. Finch arrived to find Bridget cheerfully humming while her body fought a battle she couldn't feel. Her temperature had climbed to heights that would have left other children delirious with pain. Yet she remained alert and conversational, asking about the interesting way her skin had changed color and whether the red spots spreading across her arms were pretty. 105 degrees, Dr. Finch murmured to Maeve, his voice heavy with the weight of numbers that spelled doom. Any other child would be unconscious by now. But Bridget O'Hara wasn't any other child. She was a vessel sailing without compass, beautiful and damned, unable to read the signs of her own distress. The fever took her on Thursday morning, while she slept peacefully in her mother's arms, her last breath soft as silk against Maeve's tear-stained cheek. Maeve O'Hara aged 10 years in the space of that week. Her hands, once steady with needle and thread, developed a tremor that never quite left them. She began checking her surviving children's temperatures obsessively, feeling for heat they couldn't register, looking for signs of illness they couldn't report. Her textile metaphors grew darker, speaking of fabric torn beyond mending, of threads pulled from the weave until the whole cloth came apart. "We're unraveling," she told Patrick one night, her voice thin as winter wind. "The children, they're beautiful tapestries with loose threads, and I can't see where the tears begin until it's too late to repair them." Patrick O'Hara listened with the patience of granite. But inside, something fundamental was shifting. The man who'd once spoken of his children as being solid as stone, tempered like good steel, began to understand that some materials, no matter how fine, were simply too fragile for the world's rough handling. The breaking point came for Patrick himself on a bitter February morning in 1869. He'd been feeling peculiar for weeks, a strange tightness in his chest that he attributed to the cold air and hard work. Pain had always been his teacher, warning him when his body reached its limits. But the cracked ribs from a scaffold fall the previous month had healed without his knowledge, setting wrong, allowing damage to accumulate in silence. He was drinking his morning coffee when the blood came. It started as just a few crimson drops in the steaming cup, dark as garnets against the brown liquid. Patrick stared at them with the same detached interest his children showed their injuries, curious but unalarmed. Then more blood came, and more, until his coffee looked like communion wine and the taste of iron filled his mouth. "Maeve," he called quietly, his voice carrying the calm tone of a man discussing the weather. "I believe there's something wrong with my coffee." Dr. Finch found Patrick sitting at his kitchen table, blood-stained napkin pressed to his lips, discussing with Maeve whether they should send for the pastor. The broken ribs had punctured his lung, creating internal bleeding that would have sent any other man screaming to his doctor weeks ago. Patrick O'Hara had simply noted it as a curiosity and continued working. "How long have you been coughing blood?" Dr. Finch asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Coughing?" Patrick considered this carefully. "I don't recall coughing. Just this strange taste, and now the coffee looks peculiar." Time, that cruelest doctor, took Patrick O'Hara 2 days later. He died as he had lived, without complaint, his scarred hands folded over his chest like prayer books, his face peaceful as a man sleeping in Sunday sunshine. His last words were about the beauty of the morning light streaming through the bedroom window, how it reminded him of granite dust catching fire in the quarry's depths. The O'Hara family dwindled like morning mist. Young Aidan, now 12 and marked by years of unnoticed injuries, developed a persistent limp from bones that had healed crooked. Cillian's hands, scarred by countless cuts and burns, began to curl inward like autumn leaves, his fingers no longer able to grip tools properly. Little Nell, sweet and cheerful as spring water, bore scars that mapped her journey through a world full of dangers she couldn't feel. Maeve struggled to keep them safe through vigilance alone, checking their bodies each night for injuries they hadn't mentioned, wrapping wounds they hadn't felt, setting bones they'd broken without noticing. But how could one woman stand guard against every sharp edge, every hot surface, every danger that lurked in a world designed for people who could feel warnings? The community that had once called them blessed began to whisper different words: cursed, unnatural, marked. Families moved their children away when the O'Hara young ones approached. The Quarry, under pressure from insurance companies and worried families, quietly stopped hiring them. Shopkeepers watched them with nervous eyes, as if their condition might be contagious. By 1875, only Maeve and Nell remained in the small house that had once echoed with the laughter of 6 children. The others had been claimed by infection, accident, or the slow accumulation of damage that bodies without pain's protection simply couldn't survive. Dr. Silas Finch, now graying at the temples and weighted by years of witnessing suffering he couldn't prevent, continued his careful documentation. His journals from those years read like a medical detective story, tracking the progression of a condition that challenged everything medicine understood about survival and protection. Decades later, in 1892, an elderly Dr. Finch sat in his study reviewing the O'Hara files one last time. His hands, marked by arthritis that he could feel all too keenly, trembled slightly as he turned the pages filled with his younger self's careful observations. Outside, snow fell on Shelburne Falls like a benediction, covering the granite quarry where the O'Hara family had lived and worked, and slowly destroyed themselves. He opened his journal to a fresh page and began to write. Final notes on the O'Hara family case, documented 1864 through 1875. In all my years of practice, no patients have taught me more about the paradoxical nature of human suffering. pain, which we universally seek to avoid, serves as life's most fundamental guardian. Without its warnings, the human body becomes a house whose alarm bells have been silenced, vulnerable to fires that burn undetected until the structure collapses. The O'Hara children lived without pain's cruel mercy, and in doing so, they revealed its essential benevolence. They were ships sailing without compass, harbors without lighthouses, bodies that could not warn themselves of approaching destruction. Their scars were worn like unread letters, carrying messages they could never receive. Medical students of the future may classify their condition as congenital analgesia, reducing their tragedy to clinical terminology, but I knew them as they lived, beautiful, damaged, brave in ways that broke the heart to witness. They faced each day with the confidence of the invulnerable, accumulating injuries like interest on an unpayable debt, their bodies healing crooked in the absence of complaint. History will remember them, if at all, as a footnote in medical literature. But in a town where granite splits under the ring of hammers, theirs were the bodies that never heard the bell. They lived in silence where screaming should be, and perhaps that silence taught us more about pain's true purpose than all the screaming in the world ever could. Dr. Finch set down his pen and closed the journal, its pages heavy with the weight of witnessed tragedy. Outside, church bells tolled the evening hour across snow-covered streets, their bronze voices carrying across a town that had almost forgotten the family that couldn't feel pain. In years to come, medical students would indeed discover the O'Hara case files tucked away in university archives. They would study the careful documentation, marvel at the detailed observations, and write papers on congenital analgesia that would advance the understanding of pain and its protective purpose. But they would never know the sound of Bridget's laughter as she examined her own fever spots, or the way Patrick's eyes lit up when he spoke of his children as being solid as granite. They would never see little Nell playing contentedly while her small hands bled from wounds she couldn't feel, or witness Eamon's puzzled smile as he tried to stand on shattered legs. The human cost of medical knowledge, written in margins and remembered in whispers, disappeared like granite dust on morning wind. And in the end, that silence, the terrible, beautiful silence where screaming should have been, became the O'Hara family's truest legacy, a reminder that pain, however cruel, serves as life's most merciful guardian, and those who live without its protection walk through the world as angels, dancing on the edge of destruction, beautiful and doomed, and utterly unaware of the precipice beneath their feet.